Stalin famously said that only a road soaked in blood leads to the promised land of socialism. And that to me is a quote that um, actually sums up Stalinism in a very good way. And Stalin wasn't simply using religious language because in the early stage of his life he was trying to become a priest. No, I think that communism in many ways is uh, like a religion. The dogmatic thinking, this idea that in the name uh, of the highest good, everything is permitted, and instead of paradise, there is the secular utopia that both Stalin and Mao spoke about, and they both believed that their nations are destined to take different paths to those destinations, but ultimately they both wanted to reach the promised land of socialism, as Stalin said. But there are still some important differences in their philosophies, and in this video I want to focus on the differences. And to me, the main differences between Stalinism and Maoism are the fact that Stalinism was still a reasonable philosophy. It was within bounds of reason. And one could say that Stalinism is evil, and I would agree, but ultimately Stalin did manage to turn his country into a military superpower and even into an economic superpower. Soviet Union was, after all, the country with the second largest GDP per capita. And also the Soviets achieved many great things like going into space, defeating Hitler and stuff like that, while Mao, on the other hand, well, while he did play a role in fighting the Japanese, Japan mostly lost because of other reasons. For example, the United States dropping bombs on it primarily. But yeah, and there is also one other crucial difference between Stalinism and Maoism, and that is that Stalin actually never wanted world domination. And from everything that I've read about Stalin, I do firmly believe this. And if you have any evidence to the contrary, please share it in the comment section under this video. Because, okay, here are a couple of examples that to me prove that Stalin actually never wanted world domination. For example, Harry Truman famously made all his generals read this text wrote by George Kennan, one of the most famous American Sovietologists and experts for the Soviet Union. And Kennan argues that Stalin is less of a threat than Hitler for the United States and for the world. And why is that? Well, he answers very simply, because Stalin believes in interest spheres. He just wants Eastern Europe, and he never seriously planned to attack Western Europe or even spheres of American influence in Asia, like Japan or perhaps the Philippines. No, Stalin stuck to the deal, roughly speaking. For example, he even ordered Tito not, at one point, not to send weapons to the Greek communists, because with Churchill he agreed to give Greece to Churchill. Then, on multiple occasions, Stalin gave order to actually not to the communists not to start a revolution in Iran. He ordered the communists not to start a revolution because he claimed the Iranian society is not yet ready, but many historians actually think he didn't want to provoke the United States or the West into attacking him. And while he did fear the Western powers attacking his country, and he did have plans about what to do if they attack, well, he never actually planned to be the first one to attack. While with Mao, well, I'm not so sure we can say the same thing about Mao. And I'll explain to you why. The book I read, written by Jung Chang, actually changed my perspective about Mao and about Maoism. And in some aspects, I do see Mao as more of a Hitler-like figure in some aspects of his philosophy, while Stalin is still a very different type of a person from, well, both Mao and Hitler. I would say he's still an evil psychopath, but okay. I mean, let me explain why the Soviet model of development, and I'm talking about collectivization and rapid industrialization that followed it, was successful, while the Great Leap Forward is one of the greatest catastrophes in the history of humanity, and one could even say in the history of humanity, definitely the 20th century, but one could even say in the history of humanity. Well, Soviet collectivization was a very brutal process. Most historians agree that somewhere around 10 million people died because of massive famines. And famines were a product of many things, just natural droughts, the fact that the Soviet economy was weak and isolated, and the fact that collectivization was combined with anti-religious campaign, and that many oppressed nations were kind of already on the verge of rebelling, and then the collectivization just triggered the rebellions in Ukraine and in Central Asia, and then millions die in these peasant rebellions and in the Soviet army retaliating, and then there is decolonization. But ultimately, Stalin's plan was to essentially take as much food as he can from the peasants. He knew that some people are going to starve because of it. He didn't expect it to be 10 million, but he was fine with probably a few millions people starving. And his plan was to trade this food on the international market and earn money that he could then invest into industrialization. And in the Soviet Union, I would argue that it actually did work. His crazy evil plan did work, and it wasn't that crazy. You also have to take into account that Stalin was operating in an extreme era. He truly was faced with the risk of Japan or European fascists like Hitler attacking him, or even colonial empires attacking him, while Mao, on the other hand, really wasn't facing any serious threat of another superpower attacking him and waging a war of annihilation like the one that Hitler waged on the Soviets, or like the one that Japan waged on China back in the day, in the Second World War. And that is, well, the reason for that is that after the Second World War, the world generally became a more peaceful place, and Mao really had no justifiable reason to try to turn his country into a superpower so fast. And many in his central committee even said that he is crazy and that should be a gradual process. While Stalin, on the other hand, famously said in 1931, "We have 10 years to prepare for a war." And he was surprisingly right. Exactly 10 years they had to prepare for a war. And even some historians like Isaac Deutscher, that are very critical of Stalin, actually agree that although his collectivization did cause massive peasant rebellions and deaths, that it was ultimately good to have a collectivized agriculture for the war, because then the Soviets were able to withdraw their grain supplies from the German military that was mostly fed by theft of food from the Soviets, and in that way the German military was hurt. And one should also take into account that, well, the Soviets could have perhaps tried to liberalize their society instead of going in the opposite direction, and instead of collectivizing their economy, or as Stalin said, introducing socialism even to the countryside, to the rural areas of his country. But let us for a moment imagine that the Soviet Union becomes a free market economy in the 1920s. I'm not even sure that it was actually possible, because that could potentially lead to the parts of the Red Army rebelling against Stalin had he decided to turn the Soviet Union into a capitalist country, into something similar to China today, I would argue. Had the Soviets liberalized their market in the 1920s, they would be something like the China today. But then they would have been seriously damaged by the Great Recession. And the fact that the Soviet Union was one of the few countries that actually wasn't damaged by the Great Recession also greatly helped Stalin. And it was the unpredictability of capitalism was one of the arguments that Stalin actually makes in his writings, that the opposite path is what the Soviets need to do, and that was collectivization of the agriculture and full state control over the peasantry. While Mao Zedong, on the other hand, well, I simply do not see any good reasons for Mao to actually collectivize his agriculture other than his paranoia and the fact that he wanted to fully control his people, and also his mad dream of turning China into a superpower in 5 years. And yeah, as already said, Stalin ultimately was attacked by Hitler, and that, in the eyes of many, at least to an extent, justified collectivization as a path of development. And here we can see how the Soviet utopia looks like. Here you can see the Soviet utopia for the Asian people in contrast with the evil colonialist vision for the Asian people. And yeah, here we can see the Soviet utopia, and here we can see the Chinese utopia, and I'm really not sure which one is better, this or this, but the thing with Maoism is that Maoism simply isn't a philosophy that can be considered to be within the bounds of reason, and I believe that this picture actually empirically proves what I just said. I mean, what the hell is this? Seriously, I don't know what is this? Children sitting on a giant fish. But those are all the Great Leap Forward posters that envision this Chinese utopia that will allegedly happen after the Great Leap Forward, but instead of a utopia we got 38 million people that died. That is 6% of the Chinese population in the late 1950s, according to Jung Chang. And one thing that's actually very scary about Maoism is that Mao in fact did want world domination. He famously said, "One day we will set up the Earth Control Committee." And he also said that once the Great Leap Forward works, China will have huge ships and they will finally be able to conquer Japan and the Philippines. And then he proceeded to say there will be no peace in the Pacific until we control it. And those are all very psychotic quotes that actually remind me of Hitler way more than they remind me of Stalin. And don't get me wrong, Stalin did also attack other countries, but controlling the entire Pacific, now that's truly crazy. That actually reminds me of Hitler. And as I already said, Stalin never spoke of attacking West Germany, of waging an offensive war against West Germany, while Mao still wanted his vengeance against the Japanese Empire. And it turns out he truly did want to control the world. He truly was that psychotic and evil. And we as humanity should be grateful that his Great Leap Forward actually didn't succeed. Unlike the Stalin's program of development and rapid industrialization, the Great Leap Forward not only killed many people, but also it never really produced the economic results that Mao wanted, unlike the results that the Soviets actually achieved. Well, Mao, he said, we will be a pig-growing nation and we will profit immensely from pig meat. But what Mao forgot is that you also need to have a lot of food to give. to your pigs if you are going to be a pig-ring nation. And this fiasco resulted in 50% of all the pigs in China dying. Then his campaign against the sparrows. The guy ordered the Chinese people to slaughter all the sparrows, but what then happened is the parasites that were previously eaten by sparrows just started to eat grain at rapid rates, and he begged Khrushchev to send him sparrows. And this fiasco also damaged the Chinese economy. Then his idea that steel should be made in furnaces that are located in the backyards of peasants, and not in actually highly developed and professional factories. No, he said, I'm anti-bureaucracy, and therefore we should produce steel and iron in a decentralized manner. Well, what did this create? A bunch of exploding furnaces and tanks that even couldn't actually drive straight, and helicopters that just fell from the sky. And one of his brilliant ideas was to turn this land you see here, the Yellow Earth Plateau, into fertile land. And he ordered the peasants to dig up this giant canal that would transport water into this territory. But as if you know anything about biology or earth or agriculture, you probably can guess how his efforts manifested in reality. A bunch of peasants that died from exhaustion, and nothing essentially happened. I mean, when the canal was finished, the land remained to be unfertile, and Mao's crazy idea to gain millions of kilometers of fertile land were all in vain. They were all pointless when it comes to the Yellow Earth Plateau. And there are many other reasons why the Great Leap Forward ultimately failed. It was also accompanied with destruction of historical monuments and with erection of this crazy new world that Mao envisioned. And here you can see one of these buildings, the Hall of the People. The Great Hall of the People was erected out of the ruins of the old world, as Mao would say. And ultimately the Great Leap Forward was a fiasco, unlike the Soviet program of development. And I would argue we actually should be glad that it was a fiasco, because Mao truly did want world domination, and he was ready to risk war with the Americans by attacking Japan and the Philippines. And in a bizarre way, this same craziness that motivated him to do it was the same thing that prevented him from doing it, because he truly did not understand how the economy works. In my opinion, Mao is a guy that spent 22 years of his life at war, and he simply forgot how economies under peace function. His mind simply remained at war, and unfortunately for the Chinese people, their nation remained at war with itself because of the Great Leap Forward and the other forms of destruction that existed under Maoism.